Hi. Let's talk about Photoshop. I like James Bond. I think it's pretty cool. I've loved the films since I was a kid. I could remember watching every single one of them when they aired on ABC primetime when I was a child. They aired every Saturday night at primetime, like 7 or 8 o'clock. And it was this fun thing that I always looked forward to for, like, at the time, like 20 odd weeks, because there were about 20 odd films at the time. I have all sorts of memorabilia for them. I even have the other one right there that you can see behind me. And I have all sorts of James Bond merchandise just sort of hanging up around here that people have gifted to me over the years. The thing is that when we start talking about using movies and artists and other IP, particularly in our work academically, totally fine, right? There's literally no reason why we can't do that. There's not even a legal reason why we can't do that. In fact, legal protections exist for when you do things for academic purposes that sort of throw copyright kind of out the window. The thing is that I notice a lot of students over time will submit material that features musicians or other artists, professional athletes, movie stars, other IP or just like broad themes of movies, for example. And they'll submit things that, speak to them at that point in time. Those things are great. There's a place for those things in the world because it is producing some sort of art, right? And art can be fine. Art is great. The thing is that they have literally no applicable business value at all because no business can really use those unless you're talking about big business here that can afford licensing agreements or contracts with companies like Disney or, for example. And so there's just almost never an opportunity to do it within the confines of business. But we're not in a business setting right here. We're in a class, and so we can get away with some of these things. The things that we can get away with, however, should be a pretty good quality, right? Because like a lot of things, we can work on our craft as we do some of these things. And part of that revolves around making sure that you have good ingredients, so to speak. The old adage, garbage in, garbage out, applies pretty well to a lot of the things that we do within the confines of Photoshop. So this is going to be a really short demo today. In fact, I'm actually not even going to show you all of the steps that I went through to make the thing that I'm about to show you. Instead, I'm going to talk about a few specific things because a lot of what is in this are things that we've covered a lot already. And it's things that a lot of you have already demonstrated that you already know how to do. And so I just kind of wanted to add to that in a brief little way. And so here's what I came up with for this week. It's this movie poster for Skyfall. It's one of my favorite Bond films. It's my second favorite Bond film right behind Goldfinger. But this one I used because there were a lot more interesting assets that I think I could get away with. There are a few things that I want to point out. One is that as you go out finding images for something like this, obviously Adobe Stock is not going to have it, right? Adobe Stock's not going to have a bunch of images of Daniel Craig or Judi Dench in this circumstance. But we can get these things from Google Image Search, and I see students do a lot of these things all the time. This can be okay. This is only okay within the confines of an academic setting, because using Google Image Search is almost always a bad idea, particularly if you're doing something for personal, like commercial gain or a business. But there are some features within Google Image Search that can help you. And so one example is that if you're on an image search and you go to this tools menu, you can go to size, color, type, time, and usage rights. Now, the usage rights will enable you to find images that you can actually creatively use. So if you find something that has like a Creative Commons license or even a commercial license, commercial means that you could actually use it within the confines of actually making money off of something or selling a product. The Creative Commons license makes it so that where the artist or whoever has produced the piece is saying, I don't need any recognition for this, or if I do, it's within the confines of Creative Commons and you should just cite your source to the original artist. All is going to include things like screen grabs and promotional pieces from like the official channels of like MGM or Sony Productions or movie studios or Disney or whoever. In a lot of cases, those are not going to have usage rights that you're going to be able to use. Is this perfect? No, it is not perfect, but it gets pretty close. The other thing that you can do is size. And if you come in and you just set the size to large, it will automatically do a search for images that are physically large in their dimensions, right? And so if I look at some of these things, you can come through and you can see that they're probably going to be pretty large. In fact, if I were to hover over this one's 1440 by 1080 pixels. This one over here is 1200 by 800. This one over here is 1200 by 922. So these are all physically larger images as opposed to, say, these like medium ones or even the icon size ones, where these come in at much smaller file sizes, like 690 by 690. It gets cumbersome to be able to creatively do a lot of things with that. And so when you come in and you do a Google image search, run into the tools, click on the size and set these things to large so that way you give yourself as much of the asset as you possibly can so that you start with the best possible ingredient in this circumstance. The other thing that I wanted to point out as I was doing this, and I'll start plucking some of this apart, is that this is pretty typical of like the movie poster style, right? It's like the floating head sort of thing. But I liked this approach because a lot of old classic James Bond films have these hand-drawn watercolor, like pastel style movie posters. And those movie posters were literally hand-drawn at a time when the photography or the ability to use computers didn't even exist, right? Like in the 1960s or into the 70s and even into the 80s. But once we got into the 90s, photography took over and the computer started to take over, and so they've started to develop a much more digital aesthetic to them. And so it's left a lot of the old style kind of in a timeless place of its own. That's all well and good. Thing is that there aren't that many movie franchises that have been around so long that you can actually still look back and see that much history, and the Bond films are one of those exceptions. And so if I start taking a look at this and I was like, all right, so I want to make something that's, taking a modern-ish film like Skyfall, which came out in 2012, and making it look like something that was more at home perhaps in the 1960s or 70s. And so we can do that by taking modern photographs. But as I was doing a search for Daniel Craig, this particular image looked like this. I had already removed the background here, but the image looked like this. And so the problem is that he has no head. The top of his head got a little bit of a haircut there. But this is actually a pretty easy fix. And the way that we can do this is if we zoom in a little bit. So I'm holding Option and I'm just scrolling in here. There is a tool over here called the clone stamp. Sometimes this is referred to as the rubber stamp tool because I think it used to be called the rubber stamp tool, but at any rate, it's called the clone stamp tool today. You hit the S key on your keyboard to get to that. And the option that you want is the clone stamp, not the pattern stamp, but the clone stamp tool. And by default, if you just sort of came out here and started doing something and you clicked, it's just going to show you an error and says could not use the clone stamp because the area to clone has not been defined. Option click to define a source point. That'll be Alt click on a PC. So if you click on OK, what you want to do is you want to hold the Option key and you want to click in a space that is similar to the part that you want to clone. We're lucky here because hair is relatively pretty easy and there's not a lot of variation here, and we can just about imagine what the top of his head looks like. So if I hold the Option key, Alt on a PC, and I click in a spot that's kind of about, I don't know, right there, and then I start to drag this up like this, I can basically duplicate his hair in a way that looks pretty natural. This is because hair generally speaking, can kind of look like just about anything because it can kind of point off in different directions. And so in most circumstances, you can get away with this unless a person has an unusually neatly defined haircut. But in this case, all we did was we took existing information and we just sort of cloned it onto spots that did not have any information. This tool, by the way, works like any other brush. You can use the left and right bracket keys to get at different brush sizes. And so if you click on like the option key on top of, say, his eye, we could give James Bond a third eye. Cool, right? This is the tool that does that. It's like Photoshop like 101 from like 20 years ago. Everyone did it in high school. Haha, it's funny. Once you have removed the eye, once you've got this, then you can take the whole thing and sort of drag it either into a new document or save the file to then export and drag in later, which is what I did over here, where I just took his head, I flipped his image, and then I stuck him right here in this spot. Everything in here, by the way, is sitting under a layer of noise, which we will get to in a second, but I'm going to turn that off for right now, and I'm going to focus in on another thing that we haven't talked too much about in this class, which is how to make smart use of smart filters and the filter gallery. So the smart filters, which you've probably seen, I think most of you have submitted at least one thing that has a smart filter enabled. It enables you to go back and adjust the filter settings that you have applied later. So if you decide you don't want as much, or if you want to change some of the settings on it, you can go back and do that. But by default, if I came in here, for example, and let's say that I have this image of James Bond again, and I just drag him over here into this. I place him on my canvas, and I'm just going to bring him to the top here for a demonstration purpose. If I throw him in here, and then I start to fix the top of his head, which is what I did earlier, I hold the option key, and I start to do this, it's going to say, whoa, 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 the smart object must be rasterized before proceeding. Editable contents will no longer be available. Do you want to rasterize, yes or no, in the case of OK or cancel? When you drag an image in, particularly from the Finder on a Mac or on Explorer on Windows, there will be this little icon that hangs out on the bottom right corner of the image that basically says this is a smart object. It means that if the file were to be modified outside of Photoshop, for example, if you opened the file in, say, Illustrator and did something with it, or if you opened it in Preview on a Mac and cropped it, for example, and then you saved that file, the next time you came into Photoshop, Photoshop would go out and say, okay, I have to pull this image of Daniel Craig. Here's where I know to get that, and if the file has changed out on your hard drive, then it will update that inside of Photoshop. Well, when you start doing some of these more destructive edits, like the clone stamp tool, for example, it's like, well, I can't apply that to the smart object, and so you have to sort of rasterize it. And so you have no other choice here. You want to hit OK, but it takes a little icon away, and it just makes it sort of a dumb layer, so to speak. It's no longer a smart object, it's a dumb object. And so now I can come in here, and now I can sort of put the hair back, right? And so I can neatly fill in the top of his head here the way that I need it to be. But the other problem that I run into is that if I want to, say, come in here and do a filter, which is what I did earlier on some of these, I would like to be able to come back and edit that later. And so the steps to be able to do this are to take the layer, make sure that you have it selected, go to Filter, and say Convert for Smart Filters. And then it will give you this option that will says to enable re-editable smart filters. The selected layer will be converted into a smart object, which is exactly what you want it to do, and you can hit OK. And what it does is it makes it into a smart object again. It does not automatically know that you brought it in from your Finder or Explorer window, and so that portion of the intelligence of the smartness of this layer is not going to be there. But it will enable you to do other intelligent things to this. And so now I can come in here and I can say go to Filter, and I can go to this filter gallery. All right. And there are lots of options in here, and it will by default always start with the place that you ended off. And in this case, it was the film grain, because I've noticed that if I use the film grain, it gives it sort of that hand-drawn sort of water texture-y movie poster kind of look. And so I liked it. But there are other options in here, like colored pencil and a cutout. There's plastic wrap, which, fine, whatever. Poster edges, which is kind of interesting from a texture standpoint. Paint daubs, which is one that you see quite often. This one here does make it look sort of like a watercolor painting, but there is a separate watercolor filter, like this one over here, and there are others down here as well that do everything from different glows, making it look like glass, and ocean ripple. There are a bunch in here, and a lot of these filters have been in Photoshop for almost as long as I can remember. They all have a few different settings that you can tweak within them, but a lot of them can be useful for different purposes, but you kind of have to know what you're doing with them. To be perfectly honest, I don't always know what I'm doing with them. So it's very rare that I come in here and I say, yes, that is the sort of style that I want. The benefit to a lot of these, particularly these sketch drawing ones, is that you can come in and then apply duplicate versions of the layer on top of itself and do different color blend modes that give you different effects. And so being able to sort of combine multiple versions of the layer on top of it with one of these filters in between or on one or more of those layers give you some interesting things. In my case, I liked the film grain. I came in here, I tweaked a few settings, and I hit OK. And so when I did that, it gives me this look. And with the smart filter applied, I can just turn on and off that setting. And if I come back and I decide, you know what, I actually want to come back and tweak it, I just double click on where it says filter gallery there, and I'm right back to where I started. And I can change, for example, the highlight area, or I can reduce the intensity. And then I can come in here and I can toggle it on and off again, or if I decide that I want to change it, I can double click where it says filter gallery, and I can come back right where I was. Now, that's most all of what I wanted to show you this week. It really is. I would say that when it comes to where we are in this class right now, think about your composition of things. Think about the details of things. It's pretty obvious sometimes when people miss, like for example, selections, like if a person has their arm bent and you've removed the background behind them, and then you leave a spot in the middle of like their arms, for example, is pretty obvious. Another one for people who wear glasses is that sometimes you can see the backgrounds of things through the distortion that occurs between the edge of their frame, or the edge of their lens rather, and their face. It's a pretty common one that I see a lot. The other thing is pay attention to the typography that you're using for some of these things. Pay attention to the edges of things, because what you don't ever want is for something to look like it was photoshopped. And even within the confines of this piece that I've been working on, there are actual generative AI elements in this too, which I thought was kind of an interesting way of bringing in some modern technology to an older style. The explosions that you see back there are generative AI developed. And the last thing that I did over all of this was I added a simple black layer here. This was just a black rectangle. I just dragged out a big rectangle, just like that. I filled it with black. And then I did the same thing where I went to filter, convert for smart filters. And then I went to filter, noise, add noise. And then you can come in here and tweak these settings for the amount of noise. The monochromatic, by the way, takes out all of the color actually, because if you were to zoom in on the noise, you would notice that there's actually little bits of red and green in there. So the monochromatic takes all that out. And then I hit OK. And then I just reduced the opacity and set the blend mode on that. So that way the result was this, where when I enabled it at screen and 75%, it kind of gave it a little bit more of a old-timey film look. And I kind of liked it. Everything in here is freely available for you to pluck apart. I will link to this in Canvas so that way you can see it if you're interested. But I mostly just wanted to talk to you about keeping an eye on making sure that you're using high quality, large image assets, making sure that you're cognizant and aware of the use cases for some of these things. In a commercial setting, you really can't ever do something like this, but as a fun academic exercise, why not? The other thing is that if you intend to use any of this for a portfolio, this is fine to use for that. It's usually pretty obvious to people if you just explain out and say, oh, this was for an academic pursuit. But if you intend to pursue a certain kind of work later in your life, My suggestion for you is to take the opportunity to look at some of these assignments that are coming up over the next few weeks and think about different things that can help further your portfolio, help further your career goals by doing some of the work now. I will also tell you that, as a pro tip on your portfolios, as someone who has hired a lot of people and looked at a lot of portfolios, one of the things that I tend to notice is that it's just images just sort of slapped into either a grid or just a single thing on a page. That can be okay, but it's not great. It's not enough, because as somebody who does not know you, looking at that, it's hard to suss out exactly what it was that you did. What were the confines of the assignment? What were the parameters of it? What did you have to do? Was it a group project? And if so, what did you do specifically as part of the group project? That's common if you're making like websites, for example, which can often be group projects. So take the opportunity as you're working on some of these things to maybe copy out some of the requirements from Canvas, so that way you can include that with your portfolio, and take the opportunity to write out some of the notes about what it was that you found challenging or interesting, or why you did it, the issues that you had along the way, maybe some of the revisions that you did along the way. All of those things are extremely valuable to show that both A, that you're open to feedback and criticism, which is vital for your ability to work within any sort of professional agency, and it shows that you're willing to grow, and it shows where you've come from. And so that means a lot to potential employers in the future. With that, if you have any other questions, by all means, feel free to reach out. And in the meantime, happy Photoshopping.